Welcome to the Psyche and Singularity show. This series of YouTube videos is about my new book, which just came out about 10 days ago. And so I had always intended to put out a series of videos explaining the basic ideas. The subtitle of the book is Jungian Psychology and Holographic String Theory. So right there, those are two complex topics to discuss, but I think if you read just a few of the pages in the introduction, and if you just listen here for a few minutes, you'll see that it's not as complicated as these kinds of fancy words would imply. So here is how I got the idea for this book. I'd already read Carl Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And in that biography, he described a near-death experience he had in 1944. He broke his foot, then he had a heart attack, and then he said he felt as if his consciousness rose above his body, above the hospital, out to the outermost perimeter of the Earth's atmosphere. He encountered a huge house-sized black stone temple, he called it, hollowed-out stone, like Hindu temples he had seen when he visited India. Sitting inside of this big boulder that was hollowed out was a black Hindu in a white robe sitting in the entrance hall, and then beyond that was a room in which Jung said he felt as if the people to whom he belonged in reality were living. And as he approached the Black Rock Temple, he felt his entire earthly biography stripped from him, which was extremely painful, and then he felt it all come back instantaneously, so that his whole life was present before his eyes. And then while peering into this floating temple, 1,000 miles above the earth, he says, that from his later comparing his observations of the continents of the earth, what height must you be to perceive them? He estimated to be 1,000 miles. But from that perspective, he had a grander insight in which he said it seemed to him as if each of us is interwoven blissfully with the past, the present, and the future at the horizon of the cosmos, the translation of his own words, the outermost encompassing sphere of the universe. And that while we are embodied in these three-dimensional forms, it's as if each of us lives in our own little box of illusion, imprisonment, which is tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread. So that was his insight, which when I first read it, I didn't pay that much attention to it. But later, and this was in the summer of 2010, I learned about the Stanford string theorist Leonard Suskind's theory of holographic information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos. So according to Susskind's theory, just like Jung's near-death experience account, the past, the present, and the future of all of the three-dimensional interior volume of the universe, the entire history of the universe unfolding from the Big Bang to whenever the end of the universe is, each moment in that entire temporal sequence, the information that describes each of those moments is interwoven. Well, maybe not so much interwoven, but it is smeared out as if on a holographic film on the horizon of the cosmos, and then it radiates back in with the cosmic microwave background radiation, the echo of the Big Bang, on fundamental threads of energy to create the cubic illusion of this three-dimensional world that we experience, that the three-dimensional history of the universe unfolding through time and space, according to Leonard Suskind's theory, is like a holographic movie, and the film is out at the horizon of the cosmos. So it seemed to me to be practically a perfect match between Jung's near-death experience account and Leonard Suskind's theory of information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos. So I began to study Leonard Suskind's theory, and so one important thing to know about string theory is that it is an attempt to unite the two previous theories of physics, beginning with general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravity, and then quantum mechanics, which studies things at the microscopic scale. So the theory of the very large and fast, Einstein's theory of general relativity, and the theory of the very small, quantum mechanics, you can't use one of those theories to describe the domain of the other. They are incommensurable. This has been this enormous tension in the history of physics since the discovery of quantum mechanics and the realization that it's incommensurable with general relativity. Now, I know for a lot of people who are interested enough to watch this kind of a video, that might make more sense than to some others who haven't heard these kinds of things. So I just, for right now in this introductory video, the main thing to realize is that parallel between Jung's near-death experience and Leonard Suskind's string theory. The implication that I point out in the book is that each of us, each conscious living being, each psyche, is simultaneously one with the gravitational singularity from which the universe is constantly expanding, and the encompassing horizon of the cosmos. Leonard Susskind presents his book as the antidote to any kind of theory of intelligent design of the universe. He believes sentient life is a random consequence of combinations of material atoms, and I'll discuss his nuanced argument about that, which involves the megaverse of universes. So he was not presenting this theory to support any kind of a New Age or panpsychic cosmology, which I think makes his evidence that much more trustworthy, because he wasn't trying to twist out some kind of a mystical interpretation. In fact, it seems to me he bends over backwards to present it in entirely the opposite light. But when you compare his theory to Carl Jung's psychology, as well as to the ancient cosmologies in the past, including Plato's cosmology and the Vedanta cosmology of India, then you'll see that it seems, at least it seems to me, that Leonard Susskind has expressed with mathematical precision, and his partner Gerard 't Hooft, Nobel laureate in physics, the two of them co-created this theory, although Susskind is the one who presents it in his books in this atheistic light as this antidote to superstitions about intelligent design. Gerard 't Hooft hasn't written anything in that regard to my knowledge, but Leonard Susskind has, and it says to his books that my book is a response. So the fundamental equation that I discuss in the book is Psyche equals singularity. Carl Jung worked with one of the most important quantum physicists at the very origins of that theory, Wolfgang Pauli. He initially came into contact with Pauli because Pauli was getting into trouble, having bar fights, living a little too crazily, and someone referred him to Jung. Jung then referred him to one of his students because he wanted to engage with Pauli in a project to try to see if there's any correlations between psychology and physics. And the two of them together developed a theory that the laws of psychology mirror and are mirrored by the laws of physics, because mind or psyche and matter both emerge from a more fundamental level, which the two of them called the unus mundus. They were using an alchemical term, the one world in which mind and matter are unified from that fundamental source of being, which they also call the archetype of the self, the God archetype, and the one. Everything emerges from this fundamental archetype, and mind and matter parallel each other, so that you can see in the laws of physics a kind of carbon copy of the laws of psychology. And I argue that the unus mundus, the archetype of the self, the God archetype, and the one, is what physicists call the gravitational singularity. And an important concept to think about when I discuss this equation, Psyche equals singularity, is that the singularity, you could say, well, there's a lot of different singularities. There's one in each black hole. There's the Big Bang singularity. But according to Leibniz, the mathematician who co-discovered, independently co-discovered the mathematical language of calculus at the same time as Newton, he had a postulate known as the identity of indiscernibles. And that says if you can't discern a difference between two things, then they are identical. So a philosopher, a mathematician, Robert Bruce Ware, wrote about this and applied that theory to the gravitational singularity. He says a singularity is outside of space and time, so you can't differentiate one singularity in one point in space or time from another based on spatial or temporal differences. So they're not different in their locations in space or time, and they're not different in terms of their structure. Each of them is defined as a point of zero volume and infinite density. So although they appear to be in different points of space and time, at the same time, they are all one. So even though each of us is embodied differently and appearing in different points on the timeline of history, at another fundamental level, all different singularities or all different psyches are one. Now this theory, or this equation, Psyche equals singularity, I'm taking from one of Carl Jung's letters that he wrote on February 29th, 1952. In the book, I call it the Leap Day Letter. And he's discussing an ongoing question he had. If the psyche has its own energy, if there is such a thing as psychic energy, and if Einstein was right, that energy equals mass times, or accelerated at the speed of light squared, and E equals mc squared, then psychic energy should have some mass. It should be measurable. Then how come we can't measure it? So in that letter, the Leap Day Letter, he, in the context of general relativity, he thinks about maybe it's mass that's accelerating past the speed of light, and then it loses its extension in space. And he concludes the letter with an equation: Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So the highest intensity of psychic energy, or which was equivalent to matter, would be infinite. Infinite intensity or infinite density. And the smallest space is zero volume. So you can translate Jung's equation into the simpler term Psyche equals singularity. And the singularity includes a horizon. In a black hole, it's called an event horizon, and that marks the point at which the fabric of space-time is contracting toward the central singularity at the speed of light. Beyond that, a photon would not be able to escape because of the inward tidal flow of space-time. And the inside-out version of a black hole is the Big Bang universe. Instead of contracting toward a singularity, space-time is expanding away from the central singularity, and where space is expanding at the speed of light, that's called the cosmic horizon. And again, the fundamental point, that the first parallel that got me going on this investigation, looking for parallels between Jung's theory and Leonard Suskind's string theory, was his near-death experience, where he said he felt as if the past, the present, and the future were all interwoven, blissfully also, at each point of this horizon of the cosmos, and that the three-dimensional world is an illusion, that each of us is imprisoned in a box-like illusion which is attached to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread. That's exactly what Leonard Susskind says is the case with our universe, which is one among an infinite number of parallel universes in a megaverse. All of the information describing the interior history of the universe is smeared out at each point of the horizon of the cosmos like a holographic film, which radiates in on fundamental threads of energy. And in subsequent videos, I'll get into some of the basics of string theory and how Leonard Susskind came to this conclusion. He was responding to Stephen Hawking's claim, and I will discuss that in subsequent videos. But the main point here is, given those parallels, and given Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli's theory that there would be parallels between psychology and physics, it seems to me that their prediction came true, and that we can see a fundamental parallel between Carl Jung's theory of the archetype of the self and Leonard Susskind's theory of information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos. So I discussed two of the main pieces of evidence that I investigate in the book, and that's Carl Jung's near-death experience of the cosmic horizon and his equation, which can be translated as Psyche equals singularity. So there's two more aspects of Carl Jung's psychology that I discuss in the book that I'll briefly describe here. And that the first is, as a psychologist investigating people's dreams and his own dreams and analyzing people, he came to the conclusion that each of us has a conscious ego, and then we have a personal subconscious mind, which his previous mentor from whom he rebelled, Sigmund Freud, was the great expounder of, where we repress anxieties and from our personal biographies. But what Carl Jung posited, and which he broke away from Freud in doing so, was saying that we all also have a collective unconscious mind, which is structured by archetypes of meaning. There's a synchronicity here. I don't know if it is or not. And that's the second part after I discuss his theory that we have these archetypes. So, and he relates this theory to Plato's theory of the absolute ideas of the soul, which I will also discuss in a subsequent video. But the basic idea of Carl Jung's theory of the collective unconscious mind is that all of our conscious perceptions are actually structured for us unconsciously, automatically, by certain inborn patterns of perception, which he calls archetypes. And that all of these archetypes originate ultimately from the archetype of the self. It contains all of the other archetypal forms of perception, and it unites them all. Each of the archetypes has a corresponding image that arises in our mind, and the ultimate archetype of the self, the image that arises in our mind spontaneously during dreams and awake while fantasizing or just freely associating in our thoughts, is a mandala, a circle or a sphere with a central point. Jung said that whenever a psyche is pulled between opposing demands and the tension becomes intense, the collective unconscious archetype of the self compensates that conscious mind by guiding it towards the idea of unity, the union of opposites, and that the mandala is the symbol that leads the conscious ego towards that unconscious, collective unconscious source of everything in which all opposites are united, the mandala. So, if the self archetype creates mandala images in the psyche, and if the laws of physics mirror the laws of psychology, and if mind and matter both emerge from the ultimate archetype of the self, which I'm equating with the gravitational singularity, then what material manifestation? We should find mandalas manifesting in the empirically observable material world to mirror the mandalas that we perceive inwardly in our psyches during dreams and fantasies. And I argue that black holes are the physical correlates of the mandala images that we experience within our minds, and that both of them are arising from the archetype of the self if we identify the self archetype with the gravitational singularity. A black hole is a perfect mandala. It's a central point, a mathematical point of infinite density, which is outside of space and time, surrounded by a perfect sphere, a two-dimensional surface of a three-dimensional ball. It's not a physical object. It's where space and time stop, and yet it has physically observable gravitational effects. So I argue that, in line with the prediction Jung made with Pauli, the laws of psychology do mirror the laws of physics in respect of the mandala images that arise from the archetype of the self in the collective unconscious mind, and the gravitational effects of black holes that are emerging from gravitational singularities. The self-archetype is the singularity is the self-archetype. When physicists describe the singularity, the psychologists, or at least Carl Jung, calls that the archetype of the self. And then the final part of Jung's psychology that I compare to Suskind's string theory is Jung's theory of synchronicity, which he developed also with Wolfgang Pauli. His theory of synchronicity is about meaningful coincidences. It's when two physically unrelated events nevertheless seem to be connected in a meaningful way. His example was of one of his patients who he described as having an overly Cartesian attitude, referring to René Descartes' theory of an absolute separation between the mind and the material world. The mind has soul. Reason implies soul. If you don't have reason, there's no soul, so the entire cosmos is a soulless machine. And the lady that Jung was analyzing, she was thinking in this Cartesian rationalistic kind of a way, a dualistic separation of the mind from the cosmos. And she had a dream that she was telling Jung about, and it involved a costly piece of jewelry that looked like a scarab beetle. While she was telling him that dream, he heard some buzzing against the screen or the window in his office. He looked out. It was some kind of a beetle, not a scarab beetle, but something that looked similar, which he noted was not usually seen in that part of Switzerland. He opened the window, got it in his hand, and he presented it to his patient. He said, "Here's your scarab beetle." And that helped to cure her of this feeling of separation and alienation from the rest of the cosmos, because there seemed to be some meaningful connection between the timing of her telling Jung her dream, and that beetle, a citizen of the natural world, just so happens to start buzzing against the window at that exact time. So, the theory of synchronicity asks, or begs the question, how would those two events be related? Is it really just a random coincidence, or do these things, are they really somehow connected? If they're connected somehow, what's the connecting mechanism? So in this book, Psyche and Singularity, I argue that the connecting mechanism is the horizon of the cosmos. If the past, the present, and the future of every physical and psychic event is recorded there, as implied by a comparison of Jung's near-death experience and Susskind's holographic string theory, then that would be where meaningful interpretations and physical events are actually united. And then they radiate in on these threads, which Jung perceived and which Susskind derived mathematically to create the three-dimensional objects and the scenarios unfolding through space and time. So all events are originally united. Meaningful interpretations of physical events and the physical events themselves are inextricably united at each point of the horizon of the cosmos. And that would give at least some kind of a mechanism to explain how synchronicities take place. So that, I think, is a good enough overview of the book. It's probably created a lot of confusion, but I hope it's also cleared up a few points. And in the videos to follow, I will zone in on each of the points that I mentioned in this initial video and try to give a little more clarity. So I hope you will keep watching. I hope you'll leave comments. I know that this theory is against a lot of people's philosophies. Leonard Susskind would probably have some choice words to share. I would be delighted if he would. I doubt he will, but if you want to stick up for Susskind's theory, feel free to. And if you want to leave some questions, I'll try to address them. And I hope to see you next time.